Hello, it's Randi Rhodes. Here's a clip from our show, and go to randyrhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.
Mary had a little man.
The fault. We believe that all men are created equal.
To the magnificent mosaic that is America.
From radio beacon to radio beacon.
I have a dream today.
Change has come to America.
Believe me.
Knock, knock. Who's there?
It's a figment of your imagination.
Randi Rhodes Show.
Turn up your mind.
All right, while we're waiting, let me just give you what I know. The Manafort jury has reached a verdict on 8 counts. We don't know what that verdict is. It looks like they cannot reach agreement on 10 counts, so we're waiting to see if the judge will declare a mistrial or if he will send the jurors back to deliberate some more. I don't know. I just don't know. But that's where we are, and that's what's breaking now. In the meantime, I was very excited. I tweeted this out this morning because I've reached out to talk to Chris Hedges, who is the author of a new book. I mean, he's written so many books, and they're all fresh. They're all good. They're all different, and they're all, just so well written. But the one that I really wanted to talk to him about is the new one called America, the Farewell Tour. It is a little sad, but in a way, if you don't realize where we are and what we've done, we can't get away from it. We will go down this bad road, and we will go down this bad road together instead of going down this bad road fighting and kicking and screaming and winning back democracy. It's democracy itself that is at stake here. And this book is so easy to digest because it only has 7 chapters, okay? And I love the way he structured this. I'll just read you the 7 chapters, and then we'll bring Chris on to join us in the conversation, and we'll go through them. The first chapter is called Decay. The second chapter is called Heroin. The third chapter is called Work. The fourth chapter is called Sadism. The fifth chapter is called Hate. The sixth chapter is Gambling. And the 7th chapter is Freedom. Chris, welcome to our little show here. Thank you for doing this today. I appreciate you taking time today so much. Oh, that's my fault. Sorry. Hello.
Hi, not at all. Thank you.
Thank you. All right. So, I read your book months ago. What I have in front of me is the galley, actually, and I was so grateful that they sent it to me. I have the hardcover, too, so thank you for that. It's a lovely gift, and I will be gifting it. But America, the Farewell Tour it's just the latest in your Pulitzer Prize winning career, and it does do a deep dive into the hellscape that oligarchy and authoritarian regimes create, and basically it starts from the point of view that our country is decayed. You started in Pennsylvania. Could you describe decay?
Yeah, that's physical decay, and I begin by walking through this old lace factory in Scranton, which once employed thousands of people, like many manufacturing centers throughout the United States that now lie abandoned in these deindustrialized urban wastelands. And then the problems begin to ripple outwards from there, where this has seismic impacts, not only economically within communities, but morally, as people find that they no longer have a place within the society, that they can find meaningful work, a sense of self-worth, and the physical decay that takes place within these societies soon manifests itself in very self-destructive pathologies which aren't particularly new to decaying societies, but are now writ large across the United States. And we know them, opioid addiction, and, of course, overdoses, alcoholism, gambling, hate groups, sexual sadism, suicide. These are all, as sociologists like Emil Durkheim and others pointed out, these are all manifestations of a society in deep distress. So I went and spent time over the last 2 years in, I think it's over 10 states that I reported from, with heroin addicts, with this BDSM cult-like communities in San Francisco, survivalists in Utah. Actually wrote my gambling chapter out of the Trump Taj Mahal before they closed it before I knew Trump was even going to announce for president, to take a look at the human cost that this corporate coup d'etat has carried out, and how it's affected the lives of we're now talking probably at least half the people in this country.
Yeah, and the sad thing is that when somebody loses their sense of well-being or being a breadwinner or their dignity and that they had in their work, their pride in their work, it seems very easy to turn one person against another and have that person point at the other and say you're the reason, instead of looking at deindustrialization or automation or deunionization, which is, and for the life of me, I don't understand why people don't understand, who are in these terrible predicaments, that the attack on unions is such a plot to create this mess. I mean, if corporations are always at the table, and they are through associations like the National Association of Manufacturers or the National Association of this or the National Association of that, National Rifle Association, I mean, they're always at the table to the point where they're buying our representation, they're writing the bills themselves. Why do people blame people below them instead of looking up and realizing that there's been an attack on workers organizing so that they can also be at the table when all these things are being decided?
Well, I think that's orchestrated. So we have a corporatized media, and this really comes out of the deregulation of the FCC under the Clinton administration. So you have about 5 or 6 corporations that control most of what Americans listen to or watch.
Yeah, I mean, I lived through it. I lived through it. I worked for mom and pop radio stations, up until 96. And then when the Telecommunications Deregulation Act actually went through, the big company, the Death Star, Clear Channel, bought everybody's, radio station. And suddenly I'm, station mates with Rush Limbaugh and Sean Hannity. And then next, every town across America had Rush Limbaugh on the different stations in the same market. I mean, it was just so, it was shot into the bloodstream of America, this conservative hate the union thing, just deorganize. I mean, why don't people get that destroying their organizations was the precursor to their demise?
Because I think that these, and you're right, and that these purveyors of hate and even racism and misogyny and everything else have corporate sponsors. I mean, remember what happened to Air America. Look what's happened to public broadcasting. PBS in particular is a wholly owned subsidiary of the Koch brothers. So if you went back, first of all, we had, before this media landscape was consolidated in the hands of corporations, we had all sorts of different, both in terms of print and in terms of broadcasting, media outlets that provided some diversity of opinion. More importantly, we had a public broadcasting system that gave voice to figures that were not beholden to major centers of power, and in particular financial power. So if you go back to the 1960s on PBS, you could see Malcolm X, you could see Noam Chomsky, Howard Zinn.
I love him.
James Baldwin. I mean, it goes on. These people have all been erased, these kinds of critics, from the mainstream. And I'm in deep despair. I don't own a television, so I'll only see it at the gym or in an airport or something, at CNN, which is enabled this kind of political theater, reality, television poison to infect the news. So it's, this week it's Omarosa, and then before that it was Stormy Daniels, and their function as courtiers to the centers of power while ignoring the suffering, the very real suffering of huge swaths of the American public. And I think that that's why, one, the media has an approval rating that hovers somewhere around where Congress is, and it's also why Trump is able to be effective, because so many people feel, with justification, that their voices and their lives and what they are enduring is ignored by a commercial media that is owned by a large corporation and is just about competing against other revenue streams. News isn't about news anymore. It's about the ability to create profit. And if people running a news division in General Electric or wherever it is can't produce profit, they're replaced. So CNN made more money last year than they've ever made. But what's the price of this? And we go back to the whole creation of the fictional persona of Trump on The Apprentice. I mean, these people knew he was a disaster as a business person and corrupt and has defrauded, declared bankruptcies innumerable times and defrauded his creditors and his contractors. So they create this fictional persona, and then because he is entertaining in a kind of diabolical way, they give him 23 times the coverage they give to Bernie Sanders during the presidential primary race. And now they can't get enough of them. So there is a very frightening collusion between a media that is just as entranced with making money as Trump is himself.
Well, there was a fictional movie about all this back in the day, written by Patty Chayefsky, right? And, it was supposed to be satire. It was supposed to be funny.
Yeah.
And it was. It asked the question in a comical way: what if the news had to answer to programming?
Right.
And that's exactly what happened. So, but there are still newspapers, and there's still good newspapers. There's McClatchy newspapers. There is the New York Times. There is the Wall Street Journal. If you stay away from the opinion page, it's a good newspaper. There's still the Washington Post. I mean, the number of people in this country that are willing to call themselves Republicans at this point is only 26%. So something's going right? And we did have, and back in May, we saw all these, Democratic socialists and non-establishment candidates running in the Democratic Party for the first time and winning. So there's some progress being made in spite of all the media conglomeration, no?
Yeah, well, and, we see in terms of opinion polls that universal health care, good public education, all this kind of stuff has broad popular support.
Right.
The problem is, and I think this is what I find so worrying about the Democratic Party establishment, is that those figures around Sanders or progressives who promote these ideas have either been kept at arm's length or purged from the party, and that the Democrats just will not wean themselves from corporate money. And that's, why? Why? Well, it's because the Democratic leadership, Perez, Schumer, Pelosi, are products of Wall Street. They're products of corporate donors, and they wouldn't hold political power without them. So my fear is they would, even though they understand how fragile and dangerous the ship of state has become, they don't want to give up their kind of first-class cabins. They'd rather bring it down. And this is what's worrying me, that rather than address the social inequality, the grotesque social inequality that has created the new Gilded Age, the stagnation and really decline in real terms of wages. And we know that the unemployment statistics are fictitious. They have lots of ways to hide the fact that it's far worse. One, after a year, they'll stop counting people. Two, if you work an hour a week, you're counted as employed. Or if you work for 28 hours a week, which is the average amount of time a worker in Walmart works, you're still below the poverty line, but you're counted as employed. They just are not addressing the distress and the whole notion that somehow the stock market is an indicator of a healthy economy ignores the fact, especially after the last tax cuts, that all these corporations did is buy back their own stock. They didn't invest this money into the country. They don't manufacture anything. They make money off of money. And how does that happen? Well, they get money at 0% interest rate, which is this never-ending bailout. But they still have to pay it back. So what do? They create this system of horrific debt peonage, $1.4 trillion in student loans, credit card rates that as soon as you're late on your card leap to 28%, I mean, I'm one of the fortunate ones who has health insurance, but it doesn't matter. You're still beset with these insane copays and costs. The housing crisis is re-inflated, of course. So you suppress wages intentionally, and you because you force people to borrow, and then you have these insane rates of interest. I mean, these poor students, they can never declare bankruptcy ever. I mean, they can declare it, but they can't get out. They can't escape from their loan payments to these banks. So, and they can't get jobs. I mean, it's not a sustainable system, and it's one that unfortunately those within the power elites are not addressing. And you ask, well, how can they not understand that the assault on unions, and I would argue the assault on the press, and the assault on the democratic institutions within the government, how can they not see? Well, because what these systems of propaganda have done, and Limbaugh would be an example, but all these, Sean Hannity, all these people, is that they channel this incoherent and legitimate rage towards the vulnerable, as if undocumented workers are somehow to blame for a failing economy, or Muslims. But unfortunately, absent a rational critique of power, which you're not going to get on commercial media, it works, and we are watching it work. And we are headed for another crash, which economists, Richard Wolff, Nomi Prinz, all sorts of others say will be worse than 2008 because they don't have a plan B. They can't lower interest rates any lower than zero. I mean, we saw central banks in Europe impose negative interest rates. And then what happens? Well, we know what's going to happen because Trump is already inciting people to violence against the press, against vulnerable groups. And I think the tactic of the Democratic Party, which is to just believe that Trump will implode or Trump is so repugnant, and of course he is repugnant, is somehow enough of a ticket for them to reclaim power, is very dangerous. Remember, the Clinton campaign tried that. We know from the Podesta emails they wanted Trump as the Republican nominee because they thought he would be so easy to defeat.
Well, it's so interesting to me how this party, the Republican Party, first of all, let's just address Democrats. So the DLC, which is this corporate Democratic, faction of the Democratic Party that took over the Democratic Party, it's gone. It doesn't exist anymore. It's such a failed corporate ideology that it's been rejected. Democrats wonder why they keep losing. They kept losing because they kept advocating for more bank deregulation, for more welfare cuts, for more, telecommunications deregulation acts and things like that. And I did work at Air America. I was their afternoon drive person. But I have to tell you that they criticized me more than any of the the Death Star people did. Just that aside, the Law and Order Party, the Republican Law and Order Party. It's so interesting that Law and Order is only for the little people. Law and Order is for haggard Honduran housewives. Law and Order is for people who steal a pack of gum. But it's not for guys like Michael Cohen who can plead out, and it's not for banks who are felons and who lied and who only get money fines and don't get their licenses revoked. And then the Republican Party goes ahead and bails out these banks on our dime and saddles us with the debt. And then they turn around and go, okay, and now enough time's passed that you won't remember. So here we're going to give tax cuts to people who make money off of money. But if you make money off of work, too bad for you. Your taxes might go up a little bit. The thing that I cannot understand is how people fall for it over and over again. They keep voting for that same Law and Order ticket, for that same government is not your friend. Government is not here to help you. Well, it could be. It absolutely could be. It could have a real consumer protection bureau.
Well, the question is, why have government then? I mean, what's the purpose of government? Right.
Well, and even now, they're so angry at government that they're saying privatize the war in Afghanistan, give it to Eric Prince, give him $3 billion, let him do it. But I mean, it's just so self-defeating because
it is self-defeating. But we saw the narrative change, and it began under Reagan and Thatcher, where the project to dismantle the New Deal or the labor kind of socialist programs that Britain imposed, it saw them shift the narrative. So suddenly this industrial decay and economic decline was framed in terms of an assault against national identity, and that was racial.
Right.
And it worked.
Why does that always work? Why is
I think because there is a natural distrust of the other, especially the immigrant, the person coming from the outside. That was true in Britain. It's true within the United States. And I think because, at least for some part of the white working class, the American dream at a certain point was real. That in the 1950s, for example, you could find a union job. I was in Anderson, Indiana, in this book, where old GM had all its plants. So, I mean, people, when you count overtime and everything else, they could be making, $80,000, $100,000 a year. They had benefits. They had a health plan,
pensions,
retirement plan.
Yeah.
They could buy a house. They sent their kids to college. And Clinton pushes through NAFTA. By 2006, GM's gone, and Anderson is a wreck like every other deindustrialized city in America. Moved to Monterrey, Mexico, where they pay Mexican workers $3 an hour without benefits.
But it started so much before that. Union membership peaked in 1954. In 1954, which is the better time everybody harkens back to when they say the American dream. This is what they're imagining in their heads, and including without the civil rights part of it. But the union membership was 35%. That was the peak. And, when Republicans got hip to the fact that, the Supreme Court gave us the right to unionize in 1935, by 1947, they were Taft-Hartleying it. They were saying, yeah, you can't, we need to break these unions because the unions are giving the middle class too much power. And we don't like that. We're corporate, okay? And we don't need them setting their wages. We don't need them to tell us they need pensions. We don't need them to tell us they want health insurance if they're going to work for us. Screw that. So they started dismantling unions with these right-to-work states. The Republicans did way back. Way back. And from 1954 till now, union membership now, without the public unions, which just suffered a blow in the Janus decision, right?
Right.
Okay, so without public unions, only 6% of Americans are in unions. That is the real decline of the working man's power. Because that old saying, if you're not at the table, you're on the menu. Well, every lobbyist in town, 6,000 lobbyists worked on this tax bill. 6,000 of them had their hands out, and they all got what they came for.
That's right.
And we weren't at the table because we don't have an organization.
We also don't have a press. When I began in the newspaper industry, and I worked for the New York Times,
I know.
Every paper had a labor reporter. We covered labor. It was an issue. I think there's one labor reporter left in the country. I think that's at the New York Times. I don't even know if that's still true. So the voice and the plight of working men and women was shut out. Mm-hmm. And you're right. It began immediately after the war. Actually, it began before the war with the Dies Commission. But they were determined to roll back the New Deal, and they did. And they used their money and their political clout and their systems of propaganda. We look at the Powell Memo of 1971. Lewis Powell, who was responding to what Samuel Huntington calls the excess of democracy. These are from the 1960s. And they've won. John Ralston-Saul, the great Canadian intellectual, calls it a coup d'etat in slow motion, a corporate coup d'etat in slow motion. And it's over. And now we're dealing with the wreckage of it and the consequences, the human suffering that it has engendered, which is really what I wanted to portray in my book.
You did.
And that those, the sickness of that decay, and I'm talking about now the moral kind of sickness, leads to the creation. I spent time with these right-wing hate groups, the Proud Boys, the Alts of the Night Right, the Three Percenters, and these, it is not an exaggeration to call them fascist. These are fascist groups, and they take the alienation and the anger they feel, and direct it towards people of color, towards women. Of course, they celebrate quote-unquote military values, this is what happens when societies don't work.
Well, what's
I
really
saw it.
sad.
I saw it in Yugoslavia. You know, I covered the economic
Sarajevo.
meltdown
I
and
know.
war in Yugoslavia.
I know. I remember you from covering the Middle East too. But I got to say, worshiping a militarized police, worshiping an oligarchy, does it make them feel better to blame somebody else instead of looking up and seeing that somebody's peeing on you? That this entire culture is corporate and this cannot work. It just can't work. There's if you prioritize making money over work making money, they will never get.
Well, of course you're right. But we know, let's pull on Karl Marx, who's always feared what he called the lumpen proletariat, and that was that segment of an alienated working class that could ease for a small bit of power, i.e. the power to inflict violence and discrimination on a segment of the population, was always willing to do the dirty work of totalitarian or fascist or communist, in this case corporate forces. So there'll always be an element. I think what worries me is that the radical left, those forces that put pressure on the liberal class in a capitalist democracy, the Progressive Party, the old Communist Party, which kept kind of Roosevelt honest. I mean, Roosevelt in his correspondence says to other oligarchs, if we don't, in essence, give up some of our money, we're going to have a revolution. He uses the word revolution. We better give up some of it now. And that's, if the private sector can't create work, then we have to create work as government, and
right.
He creates 12 million jobs in Social Security.
Right, and that's really the answer. It's just right there.
Of course, it's the answer. But in the 1930s, there were lots of countries in Europe that went the other way with the same conditions.
I know. We were very lucky, and I don't think we're lucky.
We were lucky that time.
Yeah.
I don't know what's going to happen now.
I don't either. But I thank you so much for this book, America: The Farewell Tour. It is a guide through this hellscape that we've made and how to get out of it. Thank you so much, Chris. I hope we could talk again.
Yeah, thank you for doing it.
My pleasure.
Okay.
Bye. All right, Chris Hedges, everybody. America: The Farewell Tour. It is on sale now. This is the galley. This is not the real hardcover, which I suggest you get. Hold so you can shake with anger. RandiRhodes.com for the whole thing and a podcast. Buy a stinking podcast.